She had 2 fingers hooked in the front of my uniform when she said it. "You will sit in the back row, Clerk, do you hear me?" Her breath hit my face, and the metal chair behind my knees scraped the concrete as she shoved me back. The Family Day tent at Joint Base Lewis McChord was loud with music and smoke and kids, but in that moment all I heard was my Aunt Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Briggs using her command voice on me. "Real soldiers belong up front. Paper pushers like you sit with the spouses and kids." She spoke loud on purpose. People glanced over, then quickly looked away. My cup of lemonade crumpled in my hand until cold drink ran over my fingers. "Mom, please not here," I said. 2 rows ahead, my mother adjusted a child's jacket in front of the unit banner, pretending not to notice because that was how she had survived Eleanor for years. My aunt tightened her grip on my collar until the stitches bit my neck. "If any VIP walks in here, I do not want them thinking you speak for my family or my unit. You will sit back here, you will smile, and you will not open your mouth unless someone asks if the potato salad is cold enough. Do we understand each other, Clerk? Clerk." She spit it like an insult, not a job. No one moved. Less than 24 hours earlier, I had walked out of a windowless secure room after finishing an overnight report that rerouted a special operations team away from a road that looked wrong on every feed we had. On a secure line, a calm voice had said, "Copy that GHOST-12, we will adjust." And a red route on my screen had shifted to safe green. Out here under white canvas, my aunt still thought I printed itineraries and stapled leave forms. She grabbed my folding chair and dragged it 2 full rows back, scraping metal on concrete, so everyone looked again. "There," she said, dropping it between a stroller and a cooler. "Perfect. Furniture in its place." I sat, because if I stayed standing she would make a bigger scene. My heart beat under my name tape hard enough to make the fabric twitch. Up front under the banner, Eleanor laughed with a group of officers, as if she had not just manhandled her own niece. "So, Sable, do you ever deploy, or are you more office staff?" The voice came from my right. A cousin of a cousin in a unit shirt held a paper plate piled with ribs. He smiled like the question was friendly. I opened my mouth. "I work," I began. "She prints itineraries," Eleanor called out before I could finish. "Calm down, she is not saving the world." The circle around her laughed on cue. Heat climbed the back of my neck. In my head I saw the blue glow of last night's screen, the grainy image of a compound the moment a colonel asked, "Are you sure about this GHOST-12?" and waited for my yes before sending men into the dark. He never asked my duty title. He only cared that my pattern was right. Once when I was 16, Eleanor had looked over a holiday table and said, "If you ever wear the uniform, I will be the first to salute you." That memory rose now like a bad taste. On the stage, the band missed a note, and people cheered anyway. Normal bass noise rolled on while I sat in the back row swallowing the knot in my throat. Static cracked through the speakers. The music cut off mid-song. A new voice came on, calm and official. "GHOST-12. Report to the landing zone. Repeat GHOST-12 to the LZ immediately." The tent stilled. 2 sergeants near the entrance shared a quick look. "Did they just say GHOST-12? Someone whispered. Eleanor frowned up at the speaker. "What kind of ridiculous code name is that?" she said with a short, sharp laugh. My pulse jumped so fast my fingers tingled. The crushed cup slid from my hand and rolled under the chair in front of me. I stood before I could talk myself out of it, smoothed the front of my uniform where her hand had wrinkled it, and stepped into the aisle. "Sable, sit down," Eleanor snapped. "That has nothing to do with you." At the mouth of the tent, a senior non-commissioned officer appeared scanning the rows. When he saw me, his jaw unclenched. "Mom," he called across the murmurs. "Mom, SEAL Team 6 is waiting for you at the LZ." The silence that followed hit harder than any shout. The young private who had looked away before stared straight at me. My mother covered her mouth with her hand. My aunt's jaw worked, but no sound came out. For one long second we just looked at each other, her planted in the front row the way she liked, and me no longer stuck in the back where she thought I belonged. "Excuse me, Mom," I said. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain. I walked past her toward the bright strip of daylight at the edge of the tent, where the wind already smelled like fuel and dust. That was the moment my aunt finally understood that the clerk she kept in the back row was the same GHOST-12 Tier 1 teams had been trusting with their lives for years, and it was also the last day I let her decide where I was allowed to sit. If someone who spent years laughing at your work was suddenly forced to watch the truth about your value unfold in front of a crowd, what would you do? I grew up in Tacoma in the years when the rain felt constant and the walls of our small duplex felt even heavier. My mother worked night shifts as a nurse at St. Joseph, coming home with the smell of antiseptic still clinging to her scrubs, her hair flattened from 12 hours under fluorescent lights. My father had left long before my memory began, so the only adult presence who seemed to take up any real space in my life was my Aunt Eleanor Briggs. In our family, she was the only one who wore a uniform, the only one who spoke in commands rather than conversations, the one everyone silently regarded as the example of what strength was supposed to look like. I was 13 when I first noticed how the energy in the room changed whenever she walked in. People straightened their shoulders. They lowered their voices. Even my mother, who handled trauma patients daily, would shrink a little under Eleanor's gaze. My aunt loved to deliver pronouncements, and the one she repeated with religious devotion was simple. "Only uniforms matter. Everyone else is dead weight." She said it while critiquing my mother's cooking, while evaluating my report cards, while watching the news. If someone was not in the military, they were, in her words, weight that slowed the nation down. When I spilled juice on the carpet once, she glared at me like I had sabotaged a mission. "If you were in my unit, I would smoke you until you puked." I remember staring at the red blot on the carpet and wondering what it meant to be smoked and why she found satisfaction in imagining it. My mother told me not to take it personally, but everything about Eleanor was personal. She did not correct behaviors. She corrected identities. By 14, I already believed that discipline and worth were measured by how close your behavior aligned with the military standard she carried like a badge. If I woke up late on a Saturday, she would say, "You will never amount to anything if you cannot even control your mornings." If my grades dipped in algebra, she would sit at the edge of the table and mutter, "Real soldiers do not make excuses." But the moment that marked the beginning of a wound I would carry for years came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table looking over bills, rubbing her forehead, the way she always did when numbers did not cooperate. Eleanor walked in, saw the envelopes, and scoffed. "This is why officers do not marry nurses. No standards." My mother's face flushed. I felt something tighten under my ribs. For the first time, I said something back. "That is not fair. She works harder than anyone you know." It was not a heroic sentence. It did not come out steady, but it came out. Eleanor turned her head slowly toward me. Her eyes narrowed with the focus of a drill instructor selecting a target. She grabbed my arm, her fingers clamping into the soft skin above my elbow, and pulled me into the kitchen where the light flickered because the bulb had been loose for months. She leaned in until her breath touched my cheek. "Do not you ever undermine my authority again, girl. In this house, I am the rank." It was not the pain that stayed with me, but the certainty in her voice, as though she truly believed that families operated on a chain of command. The bruise on my arm lasted a week, a tight oval that turned green around the edges. My mother told me she was sorry, but said nothing to Eleanor. That silence shaped me more than the grip ever could. From that point on, my aunt inserted herself into every part of my life, as though I belonged to her command. She chose my elective classes, insisting on JROTC so I could learn real discipline. She controlled my curfew. If a friend from school invited me to a movie, she demanded their full name and their parents' occupations. She evaluated everything according to her private rubric of worthiness. "You are wasting your time with that girl. Her father works at a parts warehouse. No ambition. You do not get to choose your friends based on rank," I once said. She smiled cold and flat. In this world, rank chooses everything. My mother floated through these scenes like a shadow, always moving, always tired, always hoping to avoid conflict. She depended on Eleanor for rides when the car broke down, or for help fixing the leaking sink, and every time she hesitated to challenge her. I learned early that dependence can feel like a locked door. By 15, I had absorbed the belief that if I did not wear a combat uniform one day, if I did not match the standard she held like scripture, then I would be nothing more than the dead weight she despised. I do not think Eleanor ever wondered what her words sounded like to a teenage girl, or maybe she did, and simply did not care. There was one evening I will never forget. I was sitting at my desk finishing homework, the thin glow of my lamp the only light in the room. I heard her voice in the hallway, low but clear enough. That kid will never be soldier material. She is too soft. I froze. Something in me curled inward first, the old reflex of wanting to disappear. But something else unfolded in the same breath, a quiet kind of defiance that sat deep in my chest. On my desk was a folder I had taken from school earlier that day. Inside was a brochure about the Army, not the combat route my aunt romanticized, but the enlisted paths that led to support roles, technical roles she mocked. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it in my hand. She thought I would never be soldier material. She thought she knew exactly what my limits were. I held that brochure tighter and made a decision without saying a word. I would join the Army, but not in the way she imagined, not as a reflection of her, not as her project. I would enter on my own terms. And someday I would become something she could not measure with her narrow idea of rank. I enlisted in the spring of 2015, 3 years after that night when I held the Army brochure in my hands and promised myself I would build a life that did not orbit around my aunt's approval. MEPS in Seattle was the first place I ever felt the weight of a decision that belonged entirely to me. The fluorescent lights in the hallway hummed above rows of plastic chairs, and the floor smelled faintly of cleaning solution and nerves. When the aptitude scores came back, I stared at the sheet for a long moment. My dream was a 35 series slot, something connected to intelligence, something that used the part of my brain that saw patterns and threats before others did. But the number in front of me said I did not qualify for that yet. Administrative support was what I had earned. Not what I wanted, but what was possible now. I swallowed hard and signed anyway. I knew Eleanor would have something to say, but I also knew this was the beginning, not the end. When I told her, she smirked in a way that felt like a slap. "See, I told you, clerk material." She said it in the same tone she used when pointing out loose threads on someone else's uniform. My mother congratulated me and hugged me tightly, but I could feel her worry. Eleanor did not bother hiding her gloating. In her mind, I had proven her prophecy correct. The Army saw what she saw. A girl good enough for paperwork and little else. Basic training was both harder and easier than I expected. Harder on my body, easier on my mind. Physical exhaustion made the days blur, but I adapted quickly, and by the 3rd week I understood that discipline was not about domination, the way Eleanor wielded it, but about self-governance. The drill sergeants noticed my quiet focus. One called me sharp in that understated way NCOs sometimes use when they respect someone but do not want to inflate their ego. When I moved on to AIT and then to my first assignment at a support battalion, reality shifted. I was officially paper. Personnel files, award citations, leave packets, training rosters, and the endless overflow of forms that kept a unit functioning. I sat behind a government desk sorting documents and inputting data, listening to soldiers joke that I was the printer whisperer. "If you ever need a form, go see Hart. She will pull it up in 5 seconds." Part of me burned with embarrassment. It felt too close to the script Eleanor had written for me. But there was another part of me quietly observing everything, absorbing everything, waiting for the next opening. In the evenings after finishing my clerical duties, I would slip into any additional course I could sign up for. If it said intelligence fundamentals, threat recognition network diagrams, or SIG-ACT interpretation, I was there sitting in the back of the classroom with a pen and a notebook. I read old reports late into the night. I studied how analysts built pattern charts. I learned what indicators preceded most attacks. I memorized how insurgent cells communicated. I was only a clerk on paper. In practice, I was building a language of my own. One afternoon, a major from S2 walked by while I was reviewing a stack of outdated targeting products. He paused, raised an eyebrow, and asked why an admin soldier was reading intelligence summaries from a theater she had never deployed to. I told him the truth. I wanted to understand how decisions were made, how information saved lives, how data became warnings. He asked 3 more questions, each more pointed, each meant to test whether I understood what I was studying or just repeating words. When I answered the last one, he nodded slowly. You see patterns faster than most new analysts. He did not say it kindly or unkindly. He said it like an observation, a fact. That was the moment a small door cracked open. A few months later, the battalion began preparing for a deployment rotation. The major introduced me to a liaison supporting Joint Special Operations elements. At first, I thought it was a courtesy, a way of humoring an overly curious clerk. Instead, it became the turning point of my early career. During the ramp-up, our unit was asked to assist with several background analysis tasks. One request involved mapping potential IED routes based on limited intelligence. It was not my assignment. I was supposed to compile the training roster that day. But when the major invited me to sit in, I listened. And when he handed me a set of raw SIGACT entries to organize, I worked through the patterns until my eyes ached. That night, using the tools I had taught myself, I identified a predictable cycle in the timing and placement of previous attacks. It was not genius. It was simply clarity, a kind of quiet logic that had always lived inside me. The liaison sent the analysis forward. I did not expect anything to come of it. Weeks passed. I resumed my regular duties. I stapled forms. I updated spreadsheets. I brewed coffee strong enough to keep NCOs awake during briefings. Then the email arrived. I was sitting at my desk after final formation when the notification pinged. Subject line RE. Your route assessment saved us. My hands froze on the keyboard. I opened the message. The sender was an operations chief from SEAL Team 6. The words were simple and unadorned. Your pattern analysis allowed us to reroute in time. You prevented casualties today. At the bottom of the message was a short signature block. Beneath that, a reference code. Ref GHOST-12 candidate. I reread it 3 times. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it under my sternum. No one else in the office knew what had just happened. My aunt certainly did not. I stared at the glowing screen and understood in a single steady breath that a new path had opened. The world that had always seemed reserved for people like Eleanor was shifting toward me, not because of her, but in spite of her. And for the first time since I enlisted, I did not feel like a clerk. I felt like a shadow about to become something else entirely. By early 2019, the email from the SEAL Team 6 operations chief had become more than a line of text saved in a folder on my laptop. It had become a direction, a gravitational pull. My chain of command submitted my name for an advanced intelligence program that partnered directly with DIA and JSOC elements. When the nomination memo landed in my hands, I felt a mix of anticipation and dread. I knew the road ahead would not resemble anything I had done before. It started with the polygraph. The examiner sat across from me in a dim room with a soft, mechanical hum in the background. He asked about loyalty, foreign contacts, personal history, finances, mistakes. There is something surreal about watching your chest rise and fall under the straps, knowing your entire future depends on whether the machine interprets your truth as truth. When the clearance investigators interviewed my neighbors and former teachers, my mother whispered that she was proud of me. When they interviewed my Aunt Eleanor, she later asked why anyone would waste time vetting me for something so far above my head. I passed the TSSCI clearance process after months of waiting. The day the approval hit the system, I was assigned to a training pipeline that consumed every hour of my life. Geospatial analysis, threat network mapping, pattern of life reconstruction, indicators and warnings. the invisible architecture behind how special operations forces moved who they targeted and how they stayed alive. I spent night after night under fluorescent lights in windowless rooms, drawing lines between data points, and learning how to see not just what was there, but what was missing. I learned to recognize the rhythm inside a network, the predictable way a group breathes before it attacks. The instructors were blunt and demanding. They used real-world case studies, many ending in silence where names should have been. They said this silence was what failure sounded like. I told myself I would not add to that silence. Back home, the toxicity never shifted. Eleanor never once asked what I was studying. She only repeated her mantra in new packaging. Intelligence is just fancy paperwork. Real soldiers kick down doors. I tried once to tell her about a module on algorithmic threat prediction. She responded with a smirk. So now you are top-level clerk. I had grown used to swallowing the sting, but that one stayed in my ribs for weeks. What she could not see was the way my world had expanded. She still imagined me stapling forms in a back office, while in reality I was learning to guide operators through complex threat webs. There was a moment in 2020 when everything shifted. A JSOC colonel flew in to oversee a secure training evaluation. We were in a skiff, the kind of room that absorbed sound and secrets equally. My hands hovered above a keyboard as I briefed an analysis of an emerging network structure. When I finished, the colonel studied me without speaking. Then he said the sentence that changed the trajectory of my career. From this point forward in this building, you are GHOST-12. Your given name does not enter mission traffic. Your analysis carries operational weight. The room felt colder then, not frightening, heavy, like stepping into a role that did not allow errors. I nodded, controlling my breathing even as my pulse climbed. GHOST-12. It was not a nickname. It was a designation, a responsibility, a role in a chain that kept men alive. I left the SIF in silence and did not tell a soul outside the circle who needed to know. Some secrets are not meant to be shared. Some are meant to be carried. The months that followed were filled with evaluations and real operations. I built pattern models for multiple units, but the requests from SEAL Team 6 were different. The tempo was faster, the stakes heavier. They wanted confirmation denial or redirection within hours, sometimes minutes. They were not impressed by resumes or personalities. They cared only about whether the analysis was right. During one mission cycle, a VTC screen flickered to life with an operator's face half-shadowed under harsh lighting. Dust covered his uniform. The transmission was unstable. He leaned forward until the camera caught his eyes clearly, and he said slowly, "GHOST-12, we do not move without your green light." The line carried no flattery. It was a statement of operational fact. I felt the words settle inside me in a way nothing Eleanor had ever said could reach. I remembered her voice telling someone I would never be soldier material. But the man on the screen did not know her. He knew only whether the patterns I traced were accurate enough to keep his team alive. In that moment, I understood something I wish I had learned earlier. There are people who measure you by what you have not yet become, and there are people who measure you by what you deliver when it matters. My aunt had spent her life protecting a hierarchy built on intimidation. I had stepped into a world where only clarity and precision mattered. I carried the operator's words with me for months. During long nights when I stared at overlapping datasets until they formed coherent threads. During early morning briefs when colonels asked for quick assessments. During times I doubted myself. Each time I thought of that sentence, "We do not move without your green light." It was not praise, it was accountability. By 2022, I had reached a point where my unit trusted me completely, and JSOS relied on me consistently. Yet back in Tacoma, nothing had changed in Eleanor's mind. To her, I was still the kid who failed to reach her impossible standards, still the niece she could look down on to feel taller. What she never understood was that the world had already changed. My role had shifted from a clerk tapping on a keyboard to the analyst behind decisions that operated in the shadows. I no longer needed to argue with her. I no longer needed to convince her. Real proof lived in the secure channels and the missions that returned with everyone accounted for. I did not decide to prove her wrong. Life did it for me. And when the next chapter forced my two worlds to collide, I would learn just how deeply that truth ran. When my reassignment orders came through in the summer of 2024, placing me at a JSOC-aligned intelligence cell on Joint Base Lewis McChord, it felt strangely like being pulled into two different worlds at once. Professionally, it was a significant step. Personally, it meant returning to Tacoma, where my mother still lived, and where my Aunt Eleanor continued to dominate every family interaction with the same voice that had shaped my childhood. My mother celebrated the news the moment I told her. She said it would be good to have me close again, and she talked about cooking more often so I would not have to eat base food every night. I could hear the excitement in her voice, and it softened something in me. Being closer to her mattered. But the first thing Eleanor said when she heard about the reassignment was spoken with a confident pride that did not belong to her. I pulled some strings to get her near home. She announced this to our relatives as if it were fact. In truth, she had no involvement in any part of the assignment process, but she clung to the narrative that my entire career existed because she had shoved me onto the Army path. She repeated it during backyard gatherings as if repetition could turn fiction into reality. Each time she said it, people nodded politely and glanced at me with that familiar look that hovered somewhere between sympathy and discomfort. Being back in Tacoma fed her sense of control. She acted as if proximity meant ownership. She began calling me with tasks the way a supervisor calls a subordinate. She asked me to clean her garage, organize boxes, mow the lawn, and help with minor repairs. When I reminded her that my schedule included overnight shifts and on-call rotation inside a skiff, she dismissed it with a wave of her hand even over the phone. "You think you are too important now. Remember who put you on the Army path." It was the same line from my childhood repackaged to fit adulthood. She did not care that I spent nights working threat assessments for special operations units. To her, I was still someone she could order around to fill the empty hours in her house. My refusal irritated her. She began speaking to me like I was a soldier who had stepped out of formation. Every time she said, "Remember who put you on the Army path," something inside me tightened. I had long ago stopped believing her version of events, but hearing it repeated with such confidence made my patience thinner each time. In the middle of this tension, the Family Day announcement arrived. An official invitation from JBLM outlined the activities and location for the event, and specified that my unit would host a booth titled "Intelligence Support to Special Operations." My mother smiled when she read it. Eleanor smiled too, but not for the same reason. To her, this was an opportunity to solidify her narrative. She said loudly at a dinner gathering, "We will see what you really do. I bet it is coffee and copies." She seemed eager to walk through the event with judgment in her eyes, waiting to point at something that confirmed her long-standing belief that I was nothing more than staff pretending to be relevant. She had no idea what my actual duties involved. She had no idea how many missions I had influenced. She had no idea that decisions inside my workspace carried consequences measured in lives saved. She only saw the uniform and interpreted it through her own rigid hierarchy. And Family Day for her was a stage. For me, it was a collision I could not avoid. As the date approached, I could feel the tension pulling tighter. I worked longer shifts preparing for operations that were unrelated to the event, yet they sat parallel in my mind, like two tracks about to cross. One night shortly before Family Day, I was called for a late secure video conference with a SEAL Team 6 element, preparing for an upcoming operation. The conference began past midnight. My eyes were tired, but my focus sharpened the moment the first data feed appeared. I briefed the pattern analysis and clarified several indicators for the team leader. The call lasted almost an hour. The team leader paused before ending the transmission. His voice was steady but grateful. "If we drop by JBLM, we owe you a salute." The words were simple, yet carried weight. Operators do not speak in flourishes, they speak in facts, born from necessity. I sat still for a moment after the screen went dark, letting the sentence settle into place. It formed a quiet contrast against the dismissive tone Eleanor had used earlier that same day, when she reminded me not to embarrass her at the event. I closed my computer and leaned back in my chair. The air in the CF felt colder at night. A hum from the ventilation system filled the silence. My thoughts drifted briefly to the upcoming day and the inevitable scrutiny from my aunt. She looked forward to confirming her narrative. She expected to find proof that I was the back row clerk she had always described. But the operator's words stayed anchored in my mind. "If we drop by JBLM, we owe you a salute." It was not a prediction. It was a foreshadow. A reminder that outside the narrow world my aunt controlled there existed another world entirely. A world where my work carried influence she could not comprehend. I turned off the lights in the SIF and walked out into the cool night air. The base was quiet. The sky over JBLM had the faint glow of distant city lights. As I headed toward the parking lot, I realized something important. Family Day was no longer just an event. It was an intersection. One world would walk in expecting to assert control. The other world might walk in carrying truths my aunt could not pretend away. The stage was set long before the day arrived, and the night before it, I finally understood that the collision was not something to fear. It was overdue. Family Day began before the sun had fully risen. The parking lots at JBLM filled with minivans and sedans carrying families in bright summer clothes. Children ran ahead of their parents, pointing at static displays and inflatable slides set up across the field. The air smelled of grilled food and warm dust. My unit's tent sat near the center, a simple booth labeled Intelligence Support to Special Operations. I arrived early in my OCPs, choosing the low profile intentionally. My uniform bore only the essentials. No ribbons, no flourishes, nothing to invite attention. I preferred it that way. Within half an hour, my mother walked toward me with a soft smile, lifting her hand in a small wave. Right behind her was Eleanor. Even from a distance, I could feel the weight of her entrance. She wore her Class A uniform with every ribbon she had ever earned. Her posture announced authority before she spoke a word. People turned to look not because they knew her, but because she commanded eyes wherever she went. She reached me first and gave a curt nod, scanning my OCPs with exaggerated disappointment. No dress uniform for Family Day. You could at least look like you belong at the front. Before I could answer, she stepped past me and introduced herself to two spouses standing near the booth. "Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Briggs. My niece works here. We keep her busy with the paperwork." She said it with a smile meant to sound harmless, but every syllable was designed to establish hierarchy. I stood behind the table, arranging displays of unclassified diagrams, while my aunt fielded questions that were not hers to answer. When one soldier's wife asked what my unit actually did, Eleanor spoke before I could open my mouth. "She is more comfortable with keyboards than rucksacks. Do not expect any war stories." A few people laughed politely. My mother winced. I steadied my breathing, keeping my hands busy so they would not shake. Every comment scraped against memories I had worked hard to bury. Nights inside the skiff staring at threat feeds until my eyes burned. Hours spent analyzing routes while knowing that a single wrong indicator could cost lives. But none of that existed to my aunt. She had decided my worth long before I ever put on a uniform, and she did not intend to adjust that belief in front of an audience. As the morning stretched on, more relatives showed up. Cousins, a second uncle, a friend of Eleanor's who had never met me but greeted her as though she outranked everyone on the field. Each time someone approached the booth, Eleanor positioned herself in front of me like a gatekeeper, offering her version of my career with a rehearsed confidence. At one point, a young private recognized me from a briefing earlier that week and approached to say hello. "Ma'am, I think I saw you at the targeting rehearsal on Tuesday." Before I could answer, Eleanor stepped between us. She shook her head and said, "You must be confused. She does not brief anyone, she files." The private's face flushed, and he nodded awkwardly before walking away. I felt my jaw tighten as a hot ache spread behind my ribs. The humiliation layered itself slowly like sediment, each comment pressing heavier than the one before. I tried to smile at my mother to reassure her, but she saw through it. She always did. The heat of the afternoon grew sharper, and the noise around us grew louder. Children shrieked near the bounce houses. A local band played country music from a small stage. The mood everywhere else was cheerful. Yet inside our booth, the air vibrated with tension. A staff sergeant brought over a box of brochures and asked me a question about our intel cell's schedule for the next rotation. Before I could respond, Eleanor cut him off. She said she cannot help you with that. She does coffee and copies. The sergeant blinked in confusion. He knew who I was. He had seen my name on secure products. But he held his tongue because Family Day was not the place to argue with a lieutenant colonel, even one who did not belong to our chain of command. My reaction was quieter than the anger growing in my chest. I felt the familiar rise of heat behind my eyes. My breath grew shallow. For a moment the sound of the field faded. I saw instead a flashback of myself 3 years earlier, sitting alone in the SIF at 3 a.m, watching a threat feed refresh every few seconds as an operator team moved through a high-risk area. I had kept them alive that night, and no one outside that room had known, including the woman now calling me only a clerk. The final cut arrived when Eleanor grabbed the sleeve of my uniform and tugged me back toward the seating area behind the booth. Her voice carried loud enough for people nearby to hear. "You are only a clerk. Clerks stay in the back. Do not stand next to the officers." The words landed with the force of something rehearsed, something she had been waiting to say in front of witnesses. I heard a few murmurs from relatives and nearby soldiers. Some looked away, others stared at me with sympathy. My mother froze with her hands clasped together as though trying to keep herself from shaking. I sat in the folding chair because resisting in that moment would have created a scene my mother did not deserve. But inside me something cracked. Not a loud break, more like a quiet fissure that signaled I had reached the edge of what I could swallow. My thoughts tightened into a single truth. If she knew what I really did, she would have nothing left to say. Yet I stayed silent. I sat in that chair with my gaze fixed forward as though bracing for another blow. The microphone near the event stage squealed briefly, and then a voice came through the speakers. Clear, direct, resonant across the entire field. "GHOST-12 to the landing zone. Repeat, GHOST-12 to the LZ immediately." Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. A few soldiers glanced toward the sky instinctively. My aunt stiffened in the seat beside me, her expression tightening with confusion. What kind of ridiculous call sign is that? She said the words as if they tasted bitter. I stood slowly, feeling every eye around us. My mother pressed her fingertips to her lips. My aunt's stare followed me upward as if she could stop me with the force of her disbelief. I adjusted my patrol cap and stepped out from the back row without asking permission because permission no longer mattered. The announcement echoed again. "GHOST-12 to the LZ." I walked toward the landing zone while the crowd parted, their expressions shifting from confusion to curiosity. And behind me I felt the full weight of my aunt's shock, heavy and trembling, as the truth she had spent years denying began to surface in front of everyone. The landing zone sat at the far edge of the Family Day field, marked by orange cones and a strip of cleared grass that vibrated under the force of approaching rotor blades. As I walked toward it, the air thickened with the pulsing noise of an incoming helicopter. Conversations across the event dissolved into scattered murmurs as people shaded their eyes to look toward the sky. The helicopter appeared over the tree line, dark against the bright summer sun, a silhouette that triggered recognition among soldiers long before it even touched the ground. It looked like a modified MH-60 rather than a standard UH-60, and the mere sight of it caused a stir across the field. The engine roared as it descended, flattening the grass beneath its wash. Children clung to their parents. Caps blew off heads. The wind hit my face as I moved closer, steady and calm, as if my body already understood this rhythm. When the skids settled and the rotors slowed just enough for the crew chief to slide open the door, 3 figures stepped out. They were unmistakable even without identifiable patches. 3 SEALs in simple nondescript uniforms, followed by a JSOC 05, whose bearing radiated command so subtly that it needed no introduction. The crowd reacted first with awe, then confusion, then curiosity. People whispered. Phones lifted instinctively before being lowered by soldiers who knew better. This was not a show for public cameras. This was something else entirely. I stopped a few feet away as the JSOC officer approached. He surveyed me not with surprise but with recognition and intent, as though this meeting had been planned far earlier than I had realized. Lieutenant Hart. GHOST-12. Thank you for stepping out of the SIF for a moment. His voice carried a weight that cut through the fading rotor noise. Conversations behind me stopped completely. Even the children who had been screaming minutes earlier fell quiet. The SEAL closest to him stepped forward. He stood at attention posture, precise and unwavering, then raised his hand in a salute directed at me. "Ma'am, we requested your presence. Could not miss the chance to thank you in person." His words were steady, grounded in sincerity rather than ceremony. A second SEAL nodded once as a subtle gesture of agreement. The third regarded me with an expression I recognized from countless secure calls. The look operators give when a decision you made guided them safely home. The JSOC 05 joined them and turned to address the small but rapidly growing crowd that had gathered behind me. He spoke clearly, choosing his phrasing with care. "GHOST-12 has been providing critical threat assessments for several Tier 1 operations. These men trust her with their lives." He did not say more because more would have crossed into territory no one outside the mission needed to hear. But what he did say was enough to shift the air around us. The whispers from the crowd sharpened into clarity. A cousin of mine stood frozen, her mouth slightly open. A soldier behind her quietly muttered, "So that is your intel." Someone else said, "Wait, is that the niece she kept calling a clerk?" My mother lifted her hand to her chest and exhaled in a shaky breath that carried both relief and something close to vindication. My Aunt Eleanor stood several steps behind her, rooted to the spot, as if the earth had hardened around her feet. She stared at the SEALs, then at the JSOC officer, then at me, and none of it assembled into anything that fit the story she had built for years. The humiliated certainty in her eyes cracked. Confusion pushed through, then disbelief, then something that looked like fear. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound formed. The SEAL who had saluted me extended his hand for a brief shake. "Thank you for what you do, ma'am. You kept us alive more than once." His words landed with more force than any insult Eleanor had thrown at me in my life. Not because they were loud, but because they were true and spoken by men who lived in the consequences of the work I did. I acknowledged him with a quiet "thank you," aware that humility was the only correct response in a place where lives had been weighed and measured by the decisions we made in silence. The officer then gestured toward the aircraft, indicating they could not stay long. They had come for one purpose, and they had fulfilled it. As they stepped back toward the helicopter, the crowd parted again, this time with reverence. No one questioned the moment. No one doubted its meaning. I felt their eyes on me as strongly as I had felt their dismissal earlier, but I did not turn to meet their expressions. I did not look at my cousins or the soldiers who had overheard my aunt's derogatory comments. And most importantly, I did not look at Eleanor, not once. I kept my eyes forward because the truth of my life did not require her acknowledgement. The helicopter lifted off with a burst of wind that rippled across the landing zone and stirred loose dust around my boots. As it rose higher, the crowd watched with stunned silence. When the noise faded, the event field felt entirely different from the one I had walked through just minutes earlier. Conversations resumed slowly, but with a new energy. People spoke my call sign softly, as if trying the shape of it for the first time. A few soldiers nodded respectfully when I passed them on my way back toward the booth. My mother brushed away a tear. My aunt remained frozen, a monument of disbelief and collapsing authority. I walked past her without stopping, without giving her the chance to reclaim control. It was the first boundary I had ever set with her that she could not break. The truth had spoken for itself, and it had spoken loudly. As I returned to the main field, the murmurs followed. Not intrusive, not overwhelming. Simply a quiet acknowledgement of a world my aunt had spent years denying existed. And though I did not turn back, I could feel the question lingering in the people who had witnessed everything. It was the same question I now offer to anyone listening. Do you think I should forgive someone who spent years tearing me down, or let her face the consequences of her own contempt? The silence after the helicopter lifted away lasted through the entire evening. No messages from my aunt, no sudden attempts to reassert control in front of an audience. Just quiet. A familiar kind of quiet. The type that arrives when someone toxic is recalculating their strategy. I knew better than to believe she had accepted anything she witnessed on the landing zone. People like Eleanor do not surrender authority, they regroup. The next morning my phone buzzed before 6. Her name appeared across the screen with a short command disguised as a request. Come to the house. We need to discuss what happened yesterday. There was no pleas, no context, no acknowledgement that she had watched her entire narrative collapse in front of half the base. Only the same assumption that I owed her my time and my presence. My mother called moments later, sounding nervous. She said, "Your aunt is upset, just come talk if you can." I agreed only because I knew avoiding it would prolong the inevitable confrontation. When I arrived, the house smelled of brewed coffee and lemon cleaner. My mother hovered near the sink, wringing her hands. Eleanor stood near the dining table in her civilian clothes but carried herself as though she were still in uniform. Her posture, rigid arms crossed, jaw set. The moment I stepped inside, she spoke without greeting. "Are you using classified nonsense to turn my family against me?" Her voice came out sharp-edged and loud enough that the windows rattled slightly. I blinked once, letting her words settle. They were absurd, but predictable. When someone like her loses control, they rewrite reality until it flatters them again. Before I could respond, my mother stepped forward, weak but firm. "Eleanor, she did nothing wrong yesterday. You embarrassed her." My aunt snapped her head toward my mother. "Embarrassed me." She repeated the words with disbelief, then turned the full force of her anger back toward me. "You let those men put on a show. You stood there acting like you belonged among them. Do you understand how that made me look?" Each sentence rose in volume until her hand slammed down on the table, sending a stack of unopened mail scattering across the floor. My mother flinched. Something in my chest tightened. I had seen this escalation before. Many times. The slamming, the sudden movement, the attempt to dominate the room through shock rather than logic. She stepped closer until I could feel her breath warm and angry. "You think you are above this family now, above me. Is that it?" Her finger lifted and pointed inches from my face. "You tell me right now what lies you fed them. Tell me what game you are playing before you ruin everything I built in this family." Her face twisted as if she were fighting not just humiliation, but fear of losing her identity. For her rank was not a job. It was the foundation of her self-worth. Pull it away and she had nothing left. My mother tried to move between us, but Eleanor raised a hand sharply and said, "Stay out of this. You have coddled her for too long." The gesture triggered something deep in my memory. A flash of being 12 and having my wrist squeezed so hard it bruised. A flash of being 15 and hearing, "Do not you ever undermine my authority again, girl," whispered in a low, threatening tone in the kitchen. A flash of being 16 and told you are not going anywhere until I say so while standing near the garage door. The old fear tugged at the edges of my mind, but it no longer found a place to hold on to. I stood taller this time. I did not step back. I did not let her size or her anger fill the room the way it used to. My voice came out calm and even. "You do not control me off duty. You are not my commander anymore, and you were never my owner." The sentence cut cleanly through the tension. It was the first time in my life I had spoken those words aloud, not just to her, but to myself. For a second she looked stunned, as if the script she relied on had suddenly been torn from her hands. Then anger took over again, twisting her features. "You think one salute changes your place? Watch what happens to your career when I make a few calls." She leaned in as if expecting me to shrink, retreat, or bargain. But I held her gaze, and for the first time she saw it. The shift, the boundary, the absence of fear. Something flickered in her eyes. Confusion, then panic, because she realized she no longer had access to the version of me she could intimidate. My mother whispered, "Stop, please, just stop." But Eleanor stepped back only to pace the room like someone searching for a lost weapon. She muttered about respect, about hierarchy, about the disgrace of being made to look foolish in front of people she considered beneath her. But beneath the noise, I heard something else. Desperation. A woman watching her ability to control someone slip away inch by inch. And as I stood there, I felt the truth settle with absolute clarity. This was no longer a family disagreement. It had not been for years. This was abuse, patterned, persistent, disguised as discipline and tradition. But abuse all the same. And now it stood exposed in the quiet air of my childhood home. I squared my shoulders and let the silence expand between us. She searched for another threat to throw my way, but the room had changed, and so had I. The next move would no longer be hers. The confrontation in my mother's dining room replayed in my mind for the rest of the night. Not the shouting, not the threats. What repeated was the look in my aunt's eyes when I refused to back down, a look that said she finally understood I was no longer the child she could corner in a garage or silence with a squeeze of the wrist. But knowing that truth and acting on it were two different things. If I wanted her pattern of abuse to stop, I had to move through the system she valued so highly. Not with emotion, not with retaliation, with documentation, with process, with the same precision I used in the skiff. The next morning I drove to the Inspector General office at JBLM. The building was plain beige and quiet. Posters on the wall read phrases about integrity, accountability, and zero tolerance for abuse of authority. I sat in the waiting area filling out the intake form with careful, deliberate handwriting. The questions asked for dates, names, incidents. I felt my pulse thumping in my throat as I outlined years' worth of incidents reduced to bullet points. When the IG representative called my name, I followed him into an office that smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. He wore a calm expression, the kind that encouraged honesty without pressure. "Tell me what brings you here today." The moment he asked, the tension inside me loosened just enough for the words to spill out. I told him about Family Day, about being dragged back into the seat, about being called only a clerk in front of my own unit. I told him about the threat she made in my mother's dining room. "Watch what happens to your career when I make a few calls." Then I went deeper. I explained the long-term emotional abuse, the attempts to control my schedule off duty, the manipulation, the intimidation, the pattern that had followed me from adolescence into adulthood, disguised as discipline and family obligation. The IG leaned back, listening with an attentiveness that felt foreign after years of being dismissed by the one person who claimed to have shaped my career. He did not interrupt. He only asked for clarification when necessary. "Was the threat regarding your career explicit?" "Yes." "Did she imply she could influence your assignments?" "Yes." "Did she act in an official capacity when intimidating you?" "Yes." My voice grew steadier the longer I spoke. The fear receded, replaced by something sharper: resolve. When the IG asked about evidence, I opened the folder I had brought. Inside were printed copies of text messages, emails, and a written timeline of key incidents. Washington is a one-party consent state, which meant I did not need her permission to record conversations. But I chose not to use recordings. I wanted the case built on verifiable behavior, not a single heated moment in a kitchen. Instead, I documented dates, witnesses, patterns. Abuse rarely looks dramatic. It looks repetitive, predictable, measurable. When the IG finished reading, he exhaled slowly. "You are not the first to mention Lieutenant Colonel Briggs." The room seemed to tilt slightly. My palms grew warm. I had expected disbelief or defensiveness, not this. The IG continued, "If half of what you have described is substantiated, this could get serious." The words lingered between us like a warning and a promise. I felt my breath catch halfway. Serious for her. Serious for me. Serious for everyone who had let her behavior slide because she carried rank well. The IG explained the next steps: interviews, witnesses, pattern analysis, review of her conduct both on duty and off duty, a potential recommendation for a formal inquiry. I listened quietly, absorbing every detail. It mirrored the same methodical process I used in operational analysis. Identify the network, expose the pattern, trace the consequences. When the meeting ended, the IG handed me a card with his direct number and said, "Keep documenting. Keep dates. Do not confront her again. Let the process handle this." The walk out of the office felt heavier than the walk in. Yet underneath the fear was something else: relief. For the first time, someone in a position of authority had looked at my story and not dismissed it as family drama or exaggeration. Someone had said the words that validated every instinct I had spent years ignoring. Rank does not give anyone the right to mistreat you. The truth of that sentence echoed again when I returned to my unit that afternoon. A senior NCO, a first sergeant from the JSOC cell who had overheard parts of what happened at Family Day, called me into his office. He closed the door and spoke with the steady calm of someone who had seen every leadership flaw the Army could produce. "I heard what happened yesterday," he said, no anger, no surprise, just understanding. Then he added, "Rank does not give anyone the right to treat you like property, not even family." The comment nearly cracked something in my chest. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Sometimes the simplest truth feels like the loudest revelation. When I left the building, the evening sun cast long shadows across the pavement. The air was cool against my skin. For the first time, I felt the weight of her control begin to loosen. But the relief came paired with fear. Because I had done something she never expected me to do. I had gone outside her reach. I had touched the system she believed she could manipulate. And if the IG's warning was true, I had stepped onto a path that could unravel the authority she clung to with both hands. As I walked toward my car, I felt the tremor of uncertainty in my stomach, but layered over it was something steadier, a sense that the truth was finally moving through the channels it belonged in. Quiet, methodical, unstoppable. The first domino had fallen, and there was no taking it back. The confrontation in my mother's dining room replayed in my mind for the rest of the night. Not the shouting, not the threats. What repeated was the look in my aunt's eyes when I refused to back down. A look that said she finally understood I was no longer the child she could corner in a garage or silence with a squeeze of the wrist. But knowing that truth and acting on it were two different things. If I wanted her pattern of abuse to stop, I had to move through the system she valued so highly. Not with emotion, not with retaliation, with documentation, with process. With the same precision I used in the skiff. The next morning I drove to the Inspector General office at JBLM. The building was plain beige and quiet. Posters on the wall read phrases about integrity, accountability, and zero tolerance for abuse of authority. I sat in the waiting area filling out the intake form with careful, deliberate handwriting. The questions asked for dates, names, incidents. I felt my pulse thumping in my throat as I outlined years' worth of incidents reduced to bullet points. When the IG representative called my name, I followed him into an office that smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. He wore a calm expression, the kind that encouraged honesty without pressure. "Tell me what brings you here today." The moment he asked, the tension inside me loosened just enough for the words to spill out. I told him about Family Day, about being dragged back into the seat, about being called only a clerk in front of my own unit. I told him about the threat she made in my mother's dining room. "Watch what happens to your career when I make a few calls." Then I went deeper. I explained the long-term emotional abuse, the attempts to control my schedule off duty, the manipulation, the intimidation, the pattern that had followed me from adolescence into adulthood, disguised as discipline and family obligation. The IG leaned back, listening with an attentiveness that felt foreign after years of being dismissed by the one person who claimed to have shaped my career. He did not interrupt. He only asked for clarification when necessary. Was the threat regarding your career explicit? Yes. Did she imply she could influence your assignments? Yes. Did she act in an official capacity when intimidating you? Yes. My voice grew steadier the longer I spoke. The fear receded, replaced by something sharper. Resolve. When the IG asked about evidence, I opened the folder I had brought. Inside were printed copies of text messages, emails, and a written timeline of key incidents. Washington is a one-party consent state, which meant I did not need her permission to record conversations. But I chose not to use recordings. I wanted the case built on verifiable behavior, not a single heated moment in a kitchen. Instead, I documented dates, witnesses, patterns. Abuse rarely looks dramatic. It looks repetitive, predictable, measurable. When the IG finished reading, he exhaled slowly. You are not the first to mention Lieutenant Colonel Briggs. The room seemed to tilt slightly. My palms grew warm. I had expected disbelief or defensiveness. Not this. The IG continued, if half of what you have described is substantiated, this could get serious. The words lingered between us like a warning and a promise. I felt my breath catch halfway. Serious for her, serious for me. Serious for everyone who had let her behavior slide because she carried rank well. The IG explained the next steps: interviews, witnesses, pattern analysis, review of her conduct both on duty and off duty, a potential recommendation for a formal inquiry. I listened quietly, absorbing every detail. It mirrored the same methodical process I used in operational analysis. Identify the network, expose the pattern, trace the consequences. When the meeting ended, the IG handed me a card with his direct number and said, keep documenting. Keep dates. Do not confront her again. Let the process handle this. The walk out of the office felt heavier than the walk in. Yet, underneath the fear was something else. Relief. For the first time, someone in a position of authority had looked at my story and not dismissed it as family drama or exaggeration. Someone had said the words that validated every instinct I had spent years ignoring. Rank does not give anyone the right to mistreat you. The truth of that sentence echoed again when I returned to my unit that afternoon. A senior NCO, a first sergeant from the JSOC cell who had overheard parts of what happened at Family Day, called me into his office. He closed the door and spoke with the steady calm of someone who had seen every leadership flaw the Army could produce. I heard what happened yesterday, he said, no anger, no surprise, just understanding. Then he added, rank does not give anyone the right to treat you like property. Not even family. The comment nearly cracked something in my chest. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Sometimes the simplest truth feels like the loudest revelation. When I left the building, the evening sun cast long shadows across the pavement. The air was cool against my skin. For the first time, I felt the weight of her control begin to loosen. But the relief came paired with fear. Because I had done something she never expected me to do. I had gone outside her reach. I had touched the system she believed she could manipulate. And if the IG's warning was true, I had stepped onto a path that could unravel the authority she clung to with both hands. As I walked toward my car, I felt the tremor of uncertainty in my stomach. But layered over it was something steadier. A sense that the truth was finally moving through the channels it belonged in. Quiet, methodical, unstoppable. The first domino had fallen, and there was no taking it back. 6 months passed, and the air around JBLM shifted with the seasons. My own life moved forward quietly. I stayed focused on my JSOC work, the threat streams, the long nights inside the SIF, and the sudden deployments of teams who depended on the accuracy of every assessment I wrote. But beneath that forward motion, there was always the faint expectation that Eleanor would resurface. People like her do not disappear, they recalibrate. And one cold morning, 9 months after the investigation, she appeared exactly where I expected, yet wished she never would, near the visitor center, just outside the JBLM main gate. I spotted her before she noticed me standing stiff beside a row of concrete barriers, uniform pressed sharply even though she no longer held command. Her posture held a desperate kind of precision, as if she believed keeping every crease perfect might hold her career together a little longer. When our eyes met, she gave a small, controlled nod and motioned toward a nearby coffee shop off base. I followed because I needed the closure, not because I owed her anything. Inside the shop, the warm light softened her expression, but the tension remained coiled beneath her collar. She waited until the barista walked away before speaking. Her first words were a shock, not because of their meaning, but because of their tone. It was soft, not gentle, but softer than any version of her I had ever known. "I need to talk," she said, and for once it did not sound like a command. She took a slow breath. Her eyes hardened, then softened again as she fought for the right arrangement of humility and pride. "You work with JSOC lawyers, intel people. You can help clear this up. Tell them it was family drama that got out of hand." I stared at her, letting the words sink in. The audacity of it almost made me laugh. This was the woman who told entire rooms that I was clerical filler, the woman who grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks when I was 13, the woman who tried to turn my career into a casualty of her ego. And now she sat across from me asking for rescue. She pushed further, leaning in with the confidence of someone who still believed she could negotiate rank she no longer held. "If you help me salvage my record, I will publicly acknowledge your role. GHOST-12 and all. I will tell them you are more than a clerk." The way she spoke, the phrasing, the cadence told me everything. She still thought recognition from her mattered. She still believed she was the gatekeeper of my worth. Internally, memories unfurled one after another. The nights she mocked my ambitions. The moments she said only uniforms matter. Everyone else is dead weight. The time she forced me into the kitchen, gripping my arm to remind me she was the only rank in the family. But that world had collapsed, and I was not the girl she once controlled. I looked at her, carefully absorbing the contradiction between her words and her posture. She wanted me to believe this was reconciliation, but her eyes held calculation. She was not sorry. She was sinking, and she wanted to use me as her flotation device. I lifted my coffee cup slowly, took a quiet sip, and set it down with deliberate calm. Then I leaned forward until she had no choice but to meet my gaze fully. "You are asking the clerk in the back row to rescue a lieutenant colonel." Interesting. The silence that followed was thick, ringing with years of tension and truth. Her face twitched ever so slightly, almost breaking its hardened facade. She opened her mouth, but no words came out, just a small exhale of disbelief. She genuinely never imagined a world where I could say no, where I held the leverage, where the power dynamic that shaped my entire childhood had reversed so completely. She attempted one last push. "Sable, this is your chance to fix a misunderstanding before it becomes permanent. You know how quickly a go-more can ruin everything. You know what early retirement looks like. You can stop this." It was not a threat. It was desperation disguised as logic. And that is when something inside me settled. I understood that refusing her was not revenge. It was protection. Protection for myself, for the soldiers who had suffered under her command, and for the career she had tried to weaponize. I sat straighter, letting my voice carry the steady weight of someone who knew exactly where she stood. "This is not my mess to clean. You created it. You nurtured it. You lived by it. And now you are living with it." Her expression hardened again, the mask returning, as if she realized she had shown too much weakness. She shifted back into the rigid posture of a senior officer, trying to pretend she still held authority. But authority requires respect, not fear, and mine was no longer hers to command. Outside the window, soldiers walked past in uniform, free of the shadow she once cast. Inside the shop, the air felt clean for the first time in years. She sat in silence, absorbing the reality that her status was gone, and I would not rebuild it for her. The moment stretched long enough that I could almost hear the storyline forming in the minds of the audience, the US 50-plus watchers who would be asking themselves, will Sable hold the boundary or give in? I stood slowly gathering my things and met her eyes one last time. The era where she defined my worth was over, and the next chapter would not include her redemption at my expense. I stayed standing for a moment after delivering the line that froze the air between us. She blinked twice as if her mind refused to register that the balance of power had shifted so completely. For the first time in my life, I was not reacting to her. I was choosing. And she felt that difference immediately. She straightened her uniform jacket and tried to reassemble the authority she once wielded effortlessly. "Sit down, Sable. We are not finished." Her voice trembled under the attempt at command. I sat again, not because she ordered it, but because I wanted this moment to be delivered face to face, without any chance for her to later twist it into something it was not. "You want clarity," I said quietly. "Here it is. I will not lie for you. I told the truth once. That is enough. No raised voice, no anger, no dramatic emphasis." The calm was what rattled her. She stared at me, her jaw setting the way it did when she used to discipline soldiers 3 ranks below her. Except I was no longer 13, no longer under her roof, no longer a subordinate of any kind. She looked around the coffee shop, her eyes scanning the quiet tables, the civilians working on laptops, the barista wiping the counter. No audience. No one to intimidate, sway, or impress. The realization hollowed her expression. Her posture shifted, not in rank, but in defeat. "You do not understand what you are doing," she muttered. "A go more sticks forever. Early retirement will ruin everything I have built." For a moment I glimpsed the reality that terrifies every officer on the upward track, losing not just position but identity. But her fear was not mine to fix. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I made you a soldier." I felt the familiar sting of that sentence, the one she used as a weapon all my life, the claim that my existence, my path, my achievements were merely extensions of her authority. I let the silence rest a moment, and when I spoke, my voice was steady enough to cut cleanly. "No. You made me determined. The Army made me a soldier. JSOC made me GHOST-12. She swallowed hard, and I watched the truth land sharper than she expected. It was the first time she realized her narrative about me had shattered permanently. She no longer had authorship over my identity. Something in her posture caved. Shoulders that once commanded battalions lowered just an inch, but enough to reveal the collapse beneath. I saw exhaustion, grief rage, humiliation, all trying to hold the same space, and beneath it all the faint disbelief that her control had finally reached its endpoint. She tried one last time. A whisper. "Sable." "I was trying to make you strong." I shook my head slowly. "You were trying to make me small so you could feel big." "There is a difference." She looked away, eyes fixed on the window as if the parking lot outside held a version of her life that still existed. But that world was gone. The consequences she once dismissed as impossible were now real. In the weeks that followed, everything formalized. The IG investigation concluded. She received a permanent reprimand in her file. Her command track ended immediately. She was moved on to early retirement, a quiet exit. Nothing ceremonial, no final formation, no speeches from juniors thanking her for leadership. Reputation in the Washington National Guard and broader Army circles eroded fast. Officers who once feared her now avoided her. Soldiers who once endured her no longer had to. In the family, the shift was even sharper. People who once deferred to her began speaking openly about her temper, her cruelty, her constant need to dominate every conversation, every holiday, every decision. Others simply avoided her altogether. For the first time in decades, she was neither the center nor the thread of the room. Her influence was gone. And she knew it. The only thing she had left was the hope that I would help restore what she lost. And I had said no. That was the boundary she never believed I had the strength to hold. The day after our meeting, I visited my mother. When I told her what happened, she did not cheer, she did not scold. She simply breathed out the kind of long, soft exhale that comes when a weight has been lifted from both of us. "You did the right thing," she whispered. "Even if she never admits it, you did." Later that evening, as I walked back to my car outside the SIF, my secure phone buzzed. A short encrypted message flashed across the screen. Effective immediately, JSOC Intelligence Directorate promotes GHOST-12 to Senior Analytic role. Report for briefing Monday. I stood in the parking lot, letting the words settle under the fading Puget Sound sunlight. There was no applause, no dramatic music, no triumphant shout. Just quiet, steady affirmation that the life I built was mine and mine alone. Not hers. Not shaped by her control. Not dependent on her validation. I looked toward the base, toward the soldiers, moving between buildings, toward the helicopters, humming faintly in the distance. My path was continuing. Hers was ending. And finally, for the first time, I felt no guilt about that. Only clarity. Only peace. A new chapter waited just a few steps ahead. 1 year after that family day, I still hear the helicopter blades sometimes when the office goes quiet late at night. By then, I was fully settled into my new role at a Joint Intelligence Task Force, a secure floor inside a concrete building that looks ordinary from the outside, but hums with classified conversations behind every closed door. My days blurred into a rhythm of secure briefings, encrypted calls, and long hours staring at patterns on a screen that most people will never know existed. The units we supported were scattered across time zones and continents, but the operators who came through our spaces had one thing in common. They trusted the unseen voices and eyes that kept them alive. More and more often, when someone referenced GHOST-12 in a meeting, I would hear respect instead of doubt. There were no spotlights, no public medals, just quiet nods from people who understood exactly what it meant to have your judgment carry that kind of weight. When I walked out of the building in the evenings, the air shifted from filtered and recycled to wet and salty. I had found a small apartment on a hill overlooking Puget Sound, just big enough for a couch, a table, a bed, and a stack of after-action folders that always seemed to follow me home. At night, I would stand on the tiny balcony with a mug of coffee, watching the ferries drift like slow-moving constellations of light across the dark water. The same water I grew up near now framed a life that finally belonged to me. Inside that little apartment, there was no shouting, no slammed doors, no lectures about rank. Just the hum of the refrigerator, the distant foghorns, and my own breathing no longer held tight, waiting for the next outburst. My mother came by most Sundays carrying a casserole or a bag of groceries she insisted I did not need. She moved differently now, shoulders a little more relaxed, laughter coming easier. Without my aunt in the center of every family gathering, there was space for my mother to exist, as more than someone else's target. We cooked at my small stove while she asked about my work in the only way she could within the limits of classification. "Are you still doing the important computer things?" she would tease, and I would answer, "I am still trying to keep people alive." It was enough for both of us. Sometimes we sat by the window listening to the rain while she told stories about my childhood that did not end with my aunt correcting her. There were apologies we never put into formal sentences, but they lived in the way she squeezed my hand across the table, in the way she said, "I am proud of you," without glancing over her shoulder to see who might disapprove. The rest of the family adjusted more slowly. For years, Eleanor had been the gravitational center of every conversation, the high-ranking relative, whose approval everyone chased and whose temper everyone feared. After the investigation and early retirement, people stopped pretending they did not see the pattern. Some cousins called me quietly to say they wished they had spoken up earlier when they watched her belittle me or tear into my mother at holidays. Others avoided the subject entirely, not ready to rewrite the story they had built around her uniform and her stories of glory. Over time, though, a subtle shift took root. When there was a difficult conversation to navigate, it was not her name they mentioned, it was mine. My phone would buzz with questions about setting boundaries, about dealing with a boss who crossed the line, about helping a teenager think through military service for the right reasons, rather than to fulfill someone else's dream. I had never asked to become any kind of anchor for them, but life has a way of handing new roles to the people who finally say no. In quiet moments on the balcony, or driving home from late secure briefs, I caught myself circling the same reflection. Uniform authority and family authority are not the same thing. A rank insignia is permission to make certain decisions inside a clearly defined system with checks and balances and laws. It is not a free pass to dominate a living room, a kitchen table, a child's sense of worth. Growing up, I did not know where one ended and the other began. All I felt was the weight. Now I could see it clearly. No one, not a colonel, not a general, not a decorated veteran, gets to use service as an excuse to harm the people they claim to protect at home. You can respect the uniform and still refuse to let someone weaponize it against you. That was the hardest lesson for me to learn, and the most important one to keep. Justice in my story did not look like handcuffs or a courtroom. There was no dramatic arrest, no viral video, no perfect apology speech. Justice showed up in more ordinary ways. It looked like a reprimand in a file that would follow my aunt longer than any award listing ever had. It looked like her rank no longer opening doors that allowed her to steamroll everyone in her path. It looked like my mother speaking without flinching and relatives no longer walking on eggshells around one person. But at its core, justice meant something even deeper. It meant I finally took back the right to define who I am. Not the scared girl in the doorway, not the clerk in the back row. A soldier. An analyst whose work kept real people breathing. A woman whose worth is not measured by anyone else's pride or disappointment. Some evenings I met with younger soldiers and analysts who pulled me aside after briefings. They came with stories that sounded painfully familiar. A field-grade officer who used sarcasm like a blade, a NCO who treated them like inconveniences instead of human beings, a family member back home holding their career over their head as leverage. We would sit in a corner of the dining facility or on a bench outside the building, and I would tell them what no one told me when I was 19. You can respect the chain of command and still document abuse. You can love your family and still say this is not okay. Boundaries are not betrayal. They are proof you understand your own value. A year out from Family Day, my aunt and I were almost strangers. She lived somewhere quieter now, far from bases and formations and promotion lists. Occasionally, a holiday card would arrive at my mother's house with a short line written in stiff, careful handwriting. Hope you are well. Stay safe. Signed, Eleanor Briggs, retired lieutenant colonel. I read them once or twice and set them aside. I did not send hate back. I also did not send the reinforcement she still craved. The boundary remained exactly where I had drawn it in that coffee shop when I told her no. That was enough. As for me, I kept moving forward. Missions rotated, names changed, maps shifted. But the core of my work stayed the same. Protect people I might never meet by seeing what others miss, and telling the truth even when it is uncomfortable. On the nights when the building emptied out, and only the glow of a few screens remained, I would think of that folding chair in the back row at Family Day, and the woman who tried to keep me in it. Then I would glance at the secure phone on my desk, waiting for the next call that began with the same simple, trustful phrase. GHOST-12. What do you see? If you have listened this far, maybe some part of my story sounds uncomfortably familiar. Maybe someone in your life has used rank or money or a job title or seniority in the family to shrink you, to keep you quiet, to make you feel like you belong in the back row. If that is true, I want to ask you something. Where is the line for you? When would you say enough? What would it take for you to stand up from the chair they assigned you and step into the life you actually earned? And if the person who spent years mocking you or dismissing you or controlling you suddenly turned around and asked you to rescue them, to protect their reputation, to save their career, what would you do? Would you go back to playing small, or would you let their choices finally catch up to them? Only you can answer that. But your answer matters more than you think. Somewhere, someone else might be watching you the way younger soldiers once watched me, wondering if it is possible to push back without losing yourself. If you feel safe sharing, I would like to hear your story or your thoughts. The way you faced it, what you wish you had done sooner, what finally helped you draw the line. Your experience might be the map in the dark for someone who has not found their voice yet. And if stories about justice inside families and inside uniforms resonate with you, if you want to keep exploring what it means to hold your ground without becoming hard, I hope you will stay with us for the journeys ahead. There are more voices to hear, more patterns to break, and more people who need to remember that a seat in the back row does not define the size of their courage.